Thanks everyone for joining us. I am going to pass the mic to our opening speaker, Julian Schopp, InterAction's Vice President of our humanitarian team.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, so good morning, hello. My role is really to welcome all of you here. I've heard that yesterday was a really productive day with really great conversations. I really hope we can continue on this route and path today. So welcome again. Thank you for USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance for their support for this. I was here last year for the first iteration of this meeting. It was really an experiment. And I think we're really happy now to see a second edition and real progress on this. I think this getting together is an opportunity really to bring the conversations forward and to influence the system more broadly. And that's something that we'll be looking at all of you to do today. So, of course, I'd like to really thank Howard for hosting us again this year. This is a great location, and they've been extremely welcoming. So thank you to Howard. Thank you to IOM for co-organizing this with us, as well as NRC, Habitat for Humanity, as well as the AOR area. What does AOR stand for again? Area of Responsibility for Housing, Land, and Property of the Global Protection Cluster, with whom we work very closely, as well as Variant Solutions. So welcome. We have a great day starting now. So really unique opportunity to share experiences and move the agenda forward. So just a few words before I introduce our keynote speaker. I'm a generalist in humanitarian response, not a technical expert, either in shelter and settlements or in protection. However, HLP is essential to what we do, and we're not recognizing it. And this is the beginning of us recognizing it. We need to better understand the protection risks of the people we work with to prevent further conflict, to avoid not doing harm as we do humanitarian responses, and also to be better at preparedness. We're a system that is very much geared towards response and not necessarily enough at preparedness. Understanding the housing, land, and property rights of the people we serve is essential to our programming. But it's still very much often seen within the broader humanitarian ecosystem as a very narrow technical niche. And we hope that gatherings like today can really bring it out of this position. It's still an afterthought, and when we tackle it, we often tackle it too late. So I think as we try to improve humanitarian responses and humanitarian preparedness, we need to find ways to have the HLP conversations prior to the responses, or at least in the first phases of the responses. I think we're making progress, but there's still a lot of ways to go. So we're looking to you today to come with concrete recommendations, also from that perspective. How do we bring this issue forward within the broader humanitarian response ecosystem? So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker. So Diana Darzani de Salcedo. I got it? Wow. I'm happy. I was a little nervous about that this morning. I was repeating in the car, couldn't. Okay, so thanks. I appreciate it. Okay. So Diana is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for BHA. She started in January in this new position. As she was telling me a little earlier before we started during coffee, she feels like she's coming home. She's coming from OFDA and BHA and is really excited to be taking on these new responsibilities. So she covers a quite sleepy region in today's world, the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. But not only that, she also oversees all the technical teams at BHA, which is particularly relevant today as it relates to shelter and protection, who come together very much on the issues around HLP. So, Diana, the floor is yours. We really look forward to hearing from you. And thank you again to all of you for being here. Please.
Good morning. Give me a moment here. Let me just settle in. Thank you, Julian, for that super kind introduction. Thank you all for being here. My profound appreciation to the organizers of this event. I know Howard University, IOM, InterAction, but certainly many more sponsors, co-sponsors, and participants. This is a really exciting opportunity for me. I'm very glad to be here and to engage and speak with you all. As Julian mentioned, my name's Diana Darsney, Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance at U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. I'm just thrilled that we can be here yesterday and today, not just to engage and participate, but to listen and learn from our colleagues who are working so hard to save lives here in the United States. And then we can share how we work to do the same for the most vulnerable populations overseas. The topic, housing, land, and property, is also one that's very much near and dear to my own heart. These issues have been a constant thread throughout my professional career and very much a prominent feature in the countries where I've served. Early on, I started working on land rights and conservation land management issues with Indigenous peoples in Guyana. Later, when I sort of pivoted more to full-time humanitarian assistance work, the first site visit that I ever went to was a temporary settlement in Peru for communities that had been impacted by an earthquake. Later that day, we were doing engagements with communities that had been impacted by mudslides. And then several years later, throughout my time covering South America, I was able to go back and see this critical piece, Julian, which you just mentioned, on sort of preparedness planning and looking at how we were engaging with communities, engaging with experts, technocrats, government authorities at all levels to basically support more earthquake-resistant shelters and all forms of technology so that we could get ahead of crises. I'll just share, as we see the exponential increase in conflict, displacement, protracted crises, the need to find increasingly durable, increasingly dignified shelter solutions for so many populations in urban and rural contexts is just an incredible challenge, and it's a super prominent thread throughout the countries and the teams that I work with. So whether we're thinking about Venezuelan migrants who are living in Ecuador, Colombia, and where those families are living and how certain access to land rights or evidence of residence unlocks the door to other basic services, where we're talking about displaced families in Syria or in Ukraine, these HLP issues are just incredible, and they are a major challenge. So thank you for your brainpower, your very creative ideas, because I think in some of these contexts, we've been doing this for a very long time, and so really creative ideas are necessary. So sort of with that kind of topper, let me just pivot a bit. I mean, I know that from our perspective, crisis, conflict, it goes without saying, it knows no borders. We have disasters here in the United States. We have seen them firsthand, whether it's wildfires in California, whether it's Hurricane Katrina. But those disasters do not impact everyone equally. And that's the same in the United States as it is in our overseas countries where we work. Oh, I didn't know if I'm accidentally moving your PowerPoint slide here, but I'll leave that be. And so that sort of dynamic of how disasters impact individual populations distinctly or differently is central not just to sort of our understanding and our ability to plan and prepare, but also in terms of our response. And that's particularly the case when we think about housing, land, and property. The vulnerabilities are often more stark, more pronounced in overseas contexts than they can be in the United States, but that's not entirely the case across the board. And I just want to share that when we think about our portfolio of humanitarian assistance and humanitarian response, like natural disasters represent really only a portion or a shocking fraction of the global crises that we respond to that really elevate and include HLP concerns. So imagine, yes, you may be an individual or a community that has just survived a devastating hurricane or an earthquake, but more and more what we see are you're living in a war zone, you're close to or under the threat of active conflict. Perhaps your own government is a perpetrator of conflict, driving you from your home, driving you from your livelihood, eliminating or limiting your access to safe food and water. And so, like, no matter what type of crisis, we've been trying and really thinking and reflecting on how we can ensure HLP isn't just in a silo, that we recognize that it transects many of the traditional sectors of humanitarian response, and we want to make sure that our investments and our work reflects that. So HLP, it just is not, it cannot be the question of providing simply safe shelter or restoring safe shelter. We have to really think about this interplay with protection and ensuring that the most vulnerable, the most marginalized communities are really taken into account, that we're thinking through how we're supporting and ensuring that vulnerable populations are avoiding and we're reducing the threat of like physical or psychological harm, and that we're getting people rights so that they can rebuild, normalize, and access important services. So for example, and I'm sure many of you are very much aware, in many areas where we work, women's HLP needs are disproportionate because of discriminatory land rights and tenure issues. Many of the most vulnerable communities have no land or property. They're at the highest risk of exploitation. And then at every point of displacement, and often communities are being displaced more than once in certain crises, and if they're lucky, it may be only once or twice. We're seeing just repeated and recurrent displacement as sort of lines of conflict change in some of the areas where we work. Communities will face, individuals will face barriers to accessing rights, accessing to safe and secure housing, sort of at every step along the way. And what we've seen and what I have definitely seen with my own eyes is a safe and stable place to live can provide disenfranchised, vulnerable communities, households, families, an ability to sort of set the reset button, raise children, return to a sense of normalcy, access essential services, access health, access education, and in some cases serve as a way to unlock other government benefits. So I want to just say, and maybe this is a thread yesterday, but like HLP rights, we view them as like fundamental to rebuilding lives and communities. So when we're thinking about our programming, US government funded HLP programming, it sits at this intersection. We fund humanitarian shelter, absolutely. But we also want to ensure we're working alongside protection-focused activities. So these programs will include legal assistance for both landowners and renters to access necessary documentation, and that will then, in turn, we hope, avoid eviction or other threats. We want to prioritize responding to the unique HLP issues that are very context-specific and very country-specific, but we want to make sure we're thinking about those like from the start. So a few examples where we've been trying to think this through, and we see HLP issues, HLP rights as being like front and center. Maybe we are getting at them a little bit too late still, but we're still recognizing that they're there. In Ethiopia, a place where I lived and served for 5 years, what we're seeing now is that members of certain ethnic communities that have returned to their homes after conflicts have gone to find that their houses are destroyed due to their ethnic background. HLP rights, including compensation, other remedies, will be central in helping these communities rebuild and restart and regroup. Another example is Iraq, where we saw the impacts and the rights of renters, non-landowners be very much impacted following the territorial defeat of ISIS. You had female-headed households, you had widows that were and are very much disproportionately affected by evictions from rental properties. And then what did they do? They resorted to living in unsafe shelters, in unfinished buildings, in informal settlements. And that is just something that we want to make sure that we're proactively understanding and addressing and incorporating into our sort of prioritization of activities that we support. And then, on my most recent visit to Ukraine, I was at a collective center. Families had just relocated from, their homes had been completely and utterly destroyed. And so our partners were there. Were they providing safe shelter? Yes. Were they providing dignified shelter? Yes. Were they working with families and kids to get them registered for schools? Yes. But they were also providing this full suite of legal services so that we were helping people obtain new identification cards, establish residency, get more access to essential services, and get access and unlock certain government benefits. So that is an essential link where we have to move beyond just sort of a safe place to live and really thinking through, if this is short term, that's okay. If it's longer term, we need to make sure that the entirety of the person is being serviced. So those are just a few examples, but I wanted to share this other dynamic, which I think you all are seeing and are engaging with today, which is no matter the geography, our work in international contexts has lessons for domestic contexts and vice versa. So if we are identifying and anticipating the needs of the most vulnerable or marginalized populations, that can pay dividends when the worst happens, and we need to share those lessons learned and incorporate them no matter the context. So for example, in Nepal, years before the 2015 earthquake that took over 10,000 lives, one of our USAID technical experts was working in Kathmandu and set up about 70 sites that had been pre-identified for places that could be adequate sites for housing, for shelter, for other support structures in the event of a natural disaster. When the 2015 earthquake struck, all of those pre-established sites were used to help provide life-saving care to those who are affected. And then 7,000 miles away from Kathmandu, in the city of Portland, Oregon, we're now seeing them currently consider this same type of model and approach as part of its land use and disaster preparedness plan. So they're taking lessons learned and engaging with folks who worked on Nepal and using that to inform their own thinking and work, which is great. I want to take a moment and recognize that indeed, it hasn't always been sunshine and rainbows, and this sort of HLP field has not always been viewed so holistically. 3 decades ago, we worked in, and we still do in a lot of places, we can always get better, working in technical silos. After a disaster struck, you could see engineers and architects working together on how to build shelters, but that might not always take into account the sort of issue of rights, the issue of who may face discrimination in terms of occupying certain areas, issues and concerns around exploitation. And then separately, you may see shelter advisors, lawyers, other staff working on programs targeting vulnerable populations to work on the security of tenure. But that, in turn, may not always think through the sort of risk profile and the reality of certain existing places where housing or settlements may be, but it may not be the safest place to work. So it doesn't necessarily help us to be working to establish land tenure in a place that may put that family at risk in the medium and long term. So over the years, we at USAID, we've listened, we've learned, we've been trying to use our own voice and get our own technical experts sort of thinking through this issue of the nexus. We want to make sure that we are breaking down the silos of housing, land, and property. We're ensuring that we have this connective tissue and moments to engage with experts who can ensure that women, LGBTQI people, persons with disabilities, older adults, Indigenous people, that they have a voice, that they're included in our planning, they can access their HLP rights safely and equitably. And then we're also trying to do a lot more in just recognizing and saying out loud that in many of the places where we work, this sort of marginalized communities are in fact the majority of the population. Sometimes these marginalized communities can be upwards of 80% of the groups that we're working in. And so this means that when we take a more inclusive approach to HLP programming, this life-saving assistance, yes, it should be meeting more people, but it should also be helping us to more equitably and fairly rebuild families and communities that are often most impacted. So I think a few more points here. We are also, doubling down, whether it's a new sort of policy on like localizing our humanitarian assistance, but really, and that's not just characterized by the types of organizations that we work with, it's also characterized by like the way that we're strategically planning and thinking through our assistance. So we want to make sure we understand the local context of each unique crisis. We might understand the basics of a hurricane, but a landfall in the Philippines is not going to be the same as in Haiti. And so how do we ensure that we are really taking into account local context, local needs, local impacts into our planning, into our programming, and into our response? And we are also indeed working more and more with local organizations. They are as diverse as the populations that they serve. They are on the ground long before a disaster strikes, and oftentimes after our response ends and USAID assistance is over, those organizations, of course, are remaining in the communities. So how do we think about the future and this call to action of like, what do we concretely see as the way forward? I can offer a few ideas, but really welcome great ideas from the audience here. We have underscored here that HLP programs, we need to be thinking about a person's needs holistically. So not just physical structures, but what they need to be able to sort of routinely access safe and sustainable HLP rights. What do they need to be able to function in this new country context or their new geography, and not just sort of survive day to day, but find a way to access essential services. We want to think about these key questions as we, key questions around local context as we prioritize our own resource uses. So like, are women permitted to own property and access banking? Is ownership legally documented, or is it through informal or traditional or communal mechanisms? Is the area that we're talking about impacted by recurrent climatic shocks, or is it an area that's contaminated with mines or other explosives? Like, is this an area where many people do not have any legal or legally recognized housing, land, or property rights at all? And this can be the case as we work more and more with like informal and sort of squatter settlements. So an example of how this has fed into some of our programming and impacted the way that we're programming is in 2004, and this is an example that goes back a bit, but it is still relevant and in fact still sort of existing and in place. We began a large-scale program in Kabul, Afghanistan. So at that point, an estimated 85% of the population did not possess any documentation of home, land, or property ownership. And in that case, we worked with local authorities. We worked with them to recognize the right of occupancy as a decent approach in order to provide some level of protection against the threat of eviction, against the threat of demolition. And then even today, we see this idea and this concept for right of occupancy as a de facto way that we can appreciate and respect and further housing, land, and property rights as being very much present in our work in Kabul. I should also say, we are also a climate agency. USAID is a climate agency. We have learned from the experience of US-based groups that have incorporated recognition of HLP rights into local level managed retreat efforts that aim to reduce the adverse impacts of sea level rise. So we learned and we implemented a version of this managed retreat in the Philippines in 2013 after Typhoon Haiyan. And there we worked with local actors to plan the resettlement of shoreline residents into safer nearby neighborhoods, but we also were very much thinking of not just doing this process of relocation, but ensuring that there was this connectivity and engagement in maintaining an access to the social networks, the economic networks that communities and households had relied upon previously for their survival. So we plan to continue to learn and continue to build upon this as we engage more and more groups in the United States that are in this space. And we hope that that will better inform our own programs that are aimed at addressing the impacts of climate change. So as you go into today's sessions, I'm really interested to see some of the discussions. I hope we can all, whether we're sort of new to the field or whether you have decades of experience, whether your focus is in the United States or whether you primarily are working overseas, sort of think about, I guess, 3 messages or 3 themes that we are also thinking about a lot internally. The first is be inclusive and be an advocate. HLP efforts should not operate in a silo. We want to advocate for a holistic approach to programming. This will take into account both the context that we're working in and the totality of a person's needs. So we want to ensure that the needs of women, the needs of Indigenous people, people with disabilities, and many others who have difficulty attaining rights are front and center in the way that we're working. And again, we're not just stopping at the H part, not just the housing or the humanitarian shelter. The second is this piece that we are also working on and ensuring that we are ever more focused on, and that is elevating and centering local voices. We as humanitarian professionals have a ways to go, but we are getting better at ensuring that there are seats at the table for people who know their own challenges better than anyone else and who are best placed to solve them. And then the third is, it sounded like a point that had been touched upon yesterday a bit, but this recognition and understanding that housing, land, and property can be both a driver and a consequence of conflict. And so land disputes can cause crises or result from crisis situations, whether we're talking about armed conflict, whether we're talking about natural hazards of events, whether we're talking about water scarcity and climate change. These are issues that will absolutely both drive conflict, drive housing, land, and property issues, but also require some housing, land, and property solutions. And so I think we want to just underscore that we also want to recognize that when we leave housing, land, and property issues sort of unaddressed, that can lead to more protracted displacement. It can prevent communities from finding durable solutions. And so we're trying to, again, think more, think holistically, think long-term, and understand that this is an integral part of the way that we're working. And so my last point, I can leave you all, it's not deeply profound because it's something that you all will realize. And in the places where many of us are working, again, whether we're talking about in the United States, whether you're talking about globally, increases in conflict, climate change, these very real realities, the question of whether a conflict or a disaster or a crisis will affect a population is not a question of if, it really is a question of when. Disaster-affected individuals deserve the dignity and basic human rights of security, personal safety, continued family and community life, no matter where in the world they live, and we need to work towards that. And there's, of course, no easy solution or one-size-fits-all approach to HLP, but these types of discussions can give us an opportunity to listen, to learn, and to engage, so that when disaster strikes, whether it's here in the United States or overseas, we'll be better prepared. So thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all, and looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Diana and Julian, for really highlighting the importance of HLP across crisis response. We really appreciate both of you joining us this morning. I am going to welcome our first panel this morning on HLP and the nexus in climate-induced disaster response. So if Claudia, our moderator, and our panelists want to come up here, we can get started.
Just checking if the mic is working. Yeah. Okay. Buenos dias, good morning, and welcome to everyone here joining us in the room and also to everyone watching the live stream. My name is Claudia Sanchez de Lozada, and I am InterAction Senior Manager for Climate and Environment. I am very happy to be moderating this wonderful panel this morning that's focused on HLP and the nexus in climate-induced disaster response. Earlier this week, I was reading a report released by the International Displacement Monitoring Center that mentions that last year, we saw among the highest number of weather-related displacements in the last decade. Storms and floods accounted for over 19 million displacements. And the report also highlights what most of us already know, that disasters are frequently overlapping with conflict and violence situations and are worsening the outcomes for the people affected. So as we continue seeing the number of climate-induced disasters increase, we know we need to scale up our efforts to prepare communities, support those that have already been displaced, and also protect those that are at risk of being displaced. So in the next 45 minutes, we want to examine how effective, inclusive, and locally led land administration can support climate adaptation and disaster resilience. So here on stage, I'm joined by three wonderful panelists, and each will cover a different lens of this HLP and climate overlap and the climate crisis. So first, we have Mario Flores. Mario is the Director of Field Operations, Disaster Risk Reduction and Response at Habitat for Humanity International. He has been involved in shelter and settlements humanitarian response programs since 1999 and is based in Atlanta, Georgia. Mario will be bringing to us the pre-disaster or prevention spectrum from the work that Habitat is doing in Jamaica. Next, we have Fernando de Medina Rosales. Fernando is the HLP Global Specialist at the Norwegian Refugee Council. And Fernando has more than 15 years of experience in HLP and legal aid. And Fernando will be sharing with us learnings from the immediate response perspective from the work that NRC is doing in Somalia. And finally, we have Miriam Lopez Villegas. Miriam is the Infrastructure, Shelters, and Settlements Technical Advisor at Catholic Relief Services, and is also the focal point for housing, land, and property in the Global Humanitarian Response Department. Her experience includes strategy development, project design, and implementation. Miriam provides technical and operational guidance to colleagues across continents and is currently based in Norway. And Miriam will be sharing with us the post-disaster perspective and sharing that the learnings from CRS's work in Sierra Leone. So Mario, let me first turn to you. And I wanted to ask you, how can we incorporate HLP in preparing for, adapting to, and mitigating the impacts of climate change? We wanted to see how Habitat has taken this into consideration in Jamaica, and in terms of HLP being a critical part of prevention and DRR dialogue in the country.
Thank you. Yes, the Habitat program in Jamaica was the intervention in an urban setting, in a informal settlements, a number of informal settlements in the city of Portmore. And as you all know, informal settlements present some of the the most challenging conditions in which to work. I mean, we all know that these settlements come with high density, lack of basic services, a number of social challenges, conflicts, crime, you name it. And in addition to all of that, the lack of secure tenure, because these are spontaneous, they were created in a spontaneous way many, many, many years ago. So with the support of our main donor, USA, we implemented a program in Portmore in 3 informal settlements in which we created some improvements in their physical conditions. But one of the things that we, after consulting with the community, one of the issues that came up as a very heartfelt issue was the issue of land tenure and the constant threat of eviction that they faced from the municipality, and the fact that they were excluded from all kind of services from the municipality because they were not legally recognized as part of the city. So what we tried to implement, and land tenure, secure tenure was just one of many components in the project, but it was intended to create the sense, or to reaffirm the sense of ownership for these families who have been there for many, many, many years. So they were already part of the urban network, in a sense, and they derive their livelihood by interacting, with the rest of the city. So in terms of trying to prevent the impacts of climate change in this type of settlements, what we found to be fundamental is to increase the resilience of these families, or in other words, to reduce the vulnerability that they were facing. Introducing secure tenure was the most heartfelt intervention for them. All of them, said that if they were able to show that they were not going to be evicted, that they had the willingness to improve their housing conditions, to improve the way that they could work around the community, also to introduce community-level infrastructure, and be willing to work with the city in some projects if they were recognized by the city in terms of being a settlement that was not illegal anymore. So in a way, in a nutshell, is to reduce the vulnerability of the families living there. That was the main purpose of the secure tenure component.
Thank you. We wanted to shift gears a little bit and switch to Somalia. And we want to understand how to consider HLP in ongoing climate-induced disasters. So in that case, particularly in a drought situation. And Fernando, can you tell us how HLP rights have been central to NRC's programming and climate-induced displacement from the ongoing and worsening droughts in Somalia?
I will do that, but first, you know that Evelyn Aero, who is listed in the panel, would have liked to be here, my colleague working in East Africa. And ironically, the reason why Evelyn cannot be here is because the president of Kenya, where she's based in Nairobi, declared a tree planting holiday last week that stopped the country entirely. DHL and the American embassy stopped working, and the passport with the visa did not arrive. And that was, of course, a tree planting exercise, probably. I mean, I don't know, but I assume it is to fight climate change. So it's a pity. Maybe Evelyn is watching this online, so I'll try to do my best to represent what we do in Somalia. But to your question, what we see in Somalia, but also in other places, is that at the end of the day, the housing, land and property vulnerabilities that displaced persons face are very similar, whether they are displaced because of climate change, in the case of Somalia because of drought, or because of conflict. They end up losing livelihoods, access to livelihoods. They end up uprooted. Families may be divided because they are looking for new opportunities. They end up in locations where they are in an insecurity or tenure insecurity situation, and therefore also vulnerable to forced evictions. And the response is also very similar, whether it is a climate change cost displacement or a conflict cost displacement. We will provide legal services, intervene in disputes with alternative dispute resolution methodologies. We will work on documentation for rental agreements, etc., etc. But I think that the key also is that with these interventions, we will not be able to build any self-reliance of these communities. We also need to incorporate, and we are doing that with our livelihoods and WASH interventions, not only from the Norwegian Refugee Council side, but also working with other actors, so that the response is stronger and the communities are overcoming some of those vulnerabilities. Where I think, and this is not something that I have been able to discuss with Evelyn, but where I think that climate change, again, not only in Somalia, but in other places, will differ from conflict-induced displacement will be in terms of solutions. Solutions, on the one hand, now we have to consider when we are looking at local integration or resettlement, the potential disasters related to climate change that may occur. So that's a new element that before, when looking at tenure security for displaced communities, we were not, I think there was an awareness, but maybe not as strongly as it is today. And also in terms of return, right? Because if the land is not inhabitable because of the new environmental situation, return may not be possible, then the compensation mechanisms also may be different than what we have been seeing when it comes to conflict-induced displacement and return. Not that there is a lot of advance in that front, but also I think with climate we have new challenges to face.
Thank you. Lastly, I wanted to shift gears and talk about a little bit in post-disaster response. So we wanted to turn to you, Miriam, and ask about CRS's perspective and how can HLP considerations in humanitarian programming increase climate resilience in contexts like Sierra Leone, where climate vulnerability is high, as we saw with the landslides. And we were wondering if you could share with us some reflections from the work in Sierra Leone that can inform recovery programming in other climate vulnerable settings.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm very glad to be here. Working with the communities in Cockle Bay and College Town, we heard about multiple displacement in search of affordable rent. And these towns and families, the only housing they can afford is in the informal coastal settlements. On the other hand, the spontaneous and unplanned growth of these communities over national protected areas also challenges both their DRR and development plans of the country. The pulling factors, people moving into the cities in look for work, is perhaps more evident. But we also need to address the role of climate change as a push factors from rural areas in the ongoing accelerated urbanization. As Fernando said, return might not even feasible after that. A post-disaster response needs a macro and micro vision and attention. Zooming out, nature-based solutions need to be truly integrated. Land and natural resources are impacted or are needed for our WASH, shelter, livelihoods, and agricultural activities, as well as in most, if not all, climate change and DRR initiatives. Therefore, we must literally constrain addressing HLP rights and responsibilities connected to watershed management and forestry management, and down to the river, all the way in the protection and rehabilitation of the mangroves in the bay area that mitigates flooding and increase fishing production. Zooming in, from an HLP perspective, improving security of tenure, as Mario said, has proven to be efficient to motivate people to invest in their housing. And keywords here, we're talking about improving security of tenure, which should be understood beyond the narrow concept of private ownership. This is particularly relevant for the communities in the peripheries of Freetown, which is home to approximately 74 informal communities, and since an estimated 70% of the residents are tenants of subtenants. HLP considerations need to focus on the people who live there. Once tenure agreements and property rights are clear, this stability gives the different parties confidence to retrofit and invest in their properties, improving resilience at the household level. And shelter practitioners can protect this self-recovery investment in a confinement, technical assessment, technical supervision, training, and target provision of shelter materials. In addition, residents can get together to work on community level DRR. Again, as Mary also mentioned, we can encourage community action days. We can picture that. But we need to promote community engagement as a means of empowerment or ownership into a project beyond asking people to contribute with labor. Communities are better organized than we give them credit for. They know about the risks and opportunities, as we discussed yesterday. We need their knowledge. We need the experience of women, the reflection of the older adults, the ideas of the young. This can help designate common areas. We have a role to play promoting synergies and continuing development guidance. Through meaningful participation, some land can be reserved for community or public spaces that act as buffers zones to increase the social and ecosystem resilience against the impacts of climate change. For instance, the flooding of a football play or a camp or of an open area where people is preparing fish or shells is not as bad as the flooding suffered now with the mud inside their homes. Answering to your question, to the extent our actions are amplifying the local vision, promote hazard-resistant shelter solutions, as well as public and community land infrastructure that anticipate disaster, shelter and settlements humanitarian programming can increase climate resilience.
Now I wanted to go back to all of you because I heard in several of your responses the importance of collaborating and working with actors outside of the humanitarian space. So I wanted to ask Mario and Miriam, what has this meant with development actors in Jamaica and Sierra Leone? And also to you, Fernando, what has that meant with peace-building actors across Somalia? And also, what about local actors and community-level engagement for all of you?
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. This project in Jamaica, in the city of Portmore, this was not really implemented in a purely humanitarian setting. It was more, a development type of intervention. But it actually convened a number of actors from civil society that it was quite interesting because in addition to the community itself, that we had to set up some level of organization and participation from the community in the process. We also had the support from the local government. And that was probably the very first time that the municipality recognized this type of settlements, just by coming to the table and sitting down with them, to discuss around the project interventions. But we also had the support of academia, the University of West Indies, the University of Technology, even a university here in the US, the Florida International University, provided evaluation support for the program. We had also involvement from the business sector in Portmore. Collaborations, they wanted to see themselves as collaborating to improvements in the city. So it was actually a convening of a number of actors, at different times in the project. Habitat also put together an online platform to facilitate data management for all the regularization that was going to be implemented. We had support from the University of Technology, the use of drones, to conduct aerial surveys. So it was actually, an effort of many levels of society becoming involved into the project. And as I mentioned yesterday, just because land regularization seems to be a multi-stakeholders process, we need to have good coordination, between all the actors that become involved. So it's an opportunity actually to create awareness at the city level, that this is a process that benefits everyone and that there are opportunities for a lot of sectors in the society to become involved.
Thank you, Mario. Miriam?
Yeah, you say the keywords, collaboration, support, effort. I think it starts with nurturing relationships. Working with Caritas and other partners, CRS has presence in the community, and this presence is recognized. CRS keeps attentive to local developments. When events surpass local capacity or when processes have reached a level of complexity that require additional support, CRS approach has been seen as a useful framework, and both residents and authorities have trusted us. The work of our colleagues in the Urban Resilience Department has three aspects. One related to the legal framework, statutory process, the work on the ground, social and technical process, and the definition of land use, the zoning process. CRS aims to be a catalyzer, but these three processes originated and depend on actors outside the humanitarian space. The statutory process ensures policy alignment between different levels of government. The Freetown City Council had developed an area action plan, but this was not adopted as policy or given a statutory status at the Parliament, and therefore it was not implemented. Then CRS supported a gap analysis and liaised with the Ministry of Lands and get engaged, and also the communities, national NGOs, CSOs came on board. And of course, we also need resilient local markets to reach impact scale. The social and technical process includes consultations, focus group discussions, transit walks, members of the communities and authorities come together. And we also have an HLP learning series, which I love. And these HLP learning series have been a fantastic experience with members from Cockle Bay, College Town, Crew Bay, communities, as well with representatives from Freetown City Council, Ministry of Lands and Housing, County Planning, and local organization, Kodosapa and FEDER. We have been getting together every 2 weeks to discuss HLP issues. Participants had interest in understanding the concept of forced eviction and how HLP can contribute to the common good. Again, as we heard, this is a very heartfelt issue. I couldn't put it better. And as for the zoning process, this has two aspects. One looks at soil stability, is conducted through geotechnical assessment and geospatial analysis, and the other is dedicated to HLP. The zoning aims to organize the natural environment and built environment, the activities as well as the connections. These are defined by a set of characteristics and location, and is a bit anonymous to an extent. The need for an area plan, the objectives, including improving the climate resilience of the communities, are clear. Now, there are houses also in the most flood-prone sections of the slum. As humanitarians, it's in our mandate to advocate and assist the most vulnerable. Therefore, we need to integrate HLP, and HLP gets personnel as it relates to specific housing units, particular plot of land, buildings, or properties. When we talk about HLP, we are not dealing with an abstract concept of housing, but with actual homes.
Thank you, Miriam. Fernando?
Yes, on peace building actors first then. The key, or one of the key interventions with them, is to sensitize them and training around housing land and property issues, because they do not necessarily have that expertise. So that will be a first point of collaboration. And then also, they do have often training already on dispute resolution because of the very peace-building nature of their work. But doing this or practicing dispute resolution around housing, land and property disputes in a place like Somalia is actually quite particular. So then there is also training on the specificities of doing that type of activity through their own, when they encounter disputes through their own work in peace building. And also they are part of the referral networks, which is very important because their presence in the field will be key in order to refer particular situations that are more serious to other agencies like NRC or others with more expertise in dealing with evictions, with disputes, and with other types of HLP violations. So that will be for the peace-building actors. I understand that with local actors, over many years, we have had a network of civil society organizations that have been monitoring evictions throughout the country in a well-established mechanism, also coordinated through the HLP area of responsibility of the protection cluster. So that has been a key way of ensuring that, of course, they have also received training and the referral mechanisms are well established, but also ensuring that they have ownership over the response to the evictions problem, which in Somalia is particularly serious, with several hundreds of thousands of evictions happening every year. We also have worked with local authorities. I understand with at least 3 different communal authorities where there is a joint design of the response to evictions problems in Somalia, so that they can also be the main driver of the response whenever there is an eviction crisis happening in their territory. And that has, in my understanding, worked also very well, because then slowly the international actors can, if not withdraw completely, at least hand over the processes and the response to them. A good example of that local government engagement happened already over COVID a few years ago, when I think it was in Baidoa, the governor there issued a ban on forced evictions because of the health crisis that was happening under COVID, which was a result of advocacy with the local civil society, the HLP, and international and other international actors that together convinced with good evidence the local authorities that was not the right time to put people out of their homes, given the health crisis that was happening.
Thank you. Yep. So wanted to switch a little bit in terms of what we're talking about and focus a little bit on the financing aspect. With the number of disasters increasing, also the need for more financial assistance, and also the pot's not getting bigger. So I just wanted to ask if you can all share a little bit of just some of your the bright spots in donor engagement or points for donor advocacy on these HLP climate link and overlap. Anything that you can share with us on that financing piece? I know that that's something that always comes up in these conversations. So.
Yeah, well, in the case of the Jamaica project, we had the funding support from USAID. They had this concept called the neighborhood approach, in which it was actually investments in DRR, in risk reduction, trying to anticipate, or create resilience before a disaster strikes, particularly in areas that are disaster prone. So I don't see too much more of that nowadays. So I don't know if that is not a priority anymore, but I would say that we need to advocate for more funding to do anticipatory action, to do things before the disaster strikes. Mm-hmm. I mean, and not to be solely focused on a response. Mm-hmm. So I don't think we do too much on that. I believe that risk reduction and response, those are two sides of the same coin, but we need to be looking more at the side of DRR, actually, and consider better investments, in building resilience, in making sure that HLP becomes part of slum upgrading programs in urban settings, because there are a lot of dividends, in prevention rather than having to spend money, in post-disaster situations. That's particularly for this type of programs. We have seen also some other sources of funding coming up with resources for climate adaptation projects, but it's not enough. I mean, they're looking at certain areas that they deem are priorities, but there's still a big gap, between what is allocated for response, for post-disaster response, in comparison to what is allocated for resilience and risk reduction.
Thank you. Miriam?
Thank you. Well, scientists, environmentalists have tried to trigger action scale for decades. The sense of urgency is not new. Perhaps what is more evident is that the impact of climate change has blurred boundaries between humanitarian and development worlds. Disaster expose chronic poverty, exacerbate vulnerabilities among marginalized groups that can be even 85% of the people we serve, as we heard, and particularly those with substandard housing, including insecure tenure. Integrating HLP, particularly conducting due diligence, can be seen as insurance on the investment done by institutional donors and implemented by national and international partners, and can be part of environmental assessments to ensure our interventions do no social or environmental harm. I would say HLP is gaining momentum. We're here. And just as I saw cash and market-based approaches did 10 years ago, institutional donors saw the value, invested. International agencies and local partners that receive funding improved their systems, and this has transformed our humanitarian operations. The funding for work addressing HLP climate link will come from sources that see value in multi-stakeholder approaches, collaborating with communities and local authorities that are ready to invest in DRR, as Mario said, that see value in anticipatory action, and a program or plan beyond isolated projects that have limited long-term impact. Just to finalize, in terms of donor advocacy, I would like to return the attention to Sierra Leone. After the area action plans is developed, the Ministry of Land and the mayor herself has as a plan to invite other donors to contribute to funds to implement the actual plan. So other actors, such as the World Bank and the Africa Development Bank, have also expressed interest in catalyzing ongoing efforts. Yet they are shying away from investing due to the informality of these settlements. So my donor advocacy point I would like to make now is that we need to understand the local tenure system. Collective tenure alternatives can also be explored. Without a deeper risk analysis, well-intentioned initiatives to formalize tenure might inadvertently widen inequality and trigger eviction, displacing those we aim to serve.
Yeah, I would say that my main advocacy point will be around the timing or the cycle of the funding. When we are already struggling with short-term cycle within humanitarian response, especially when it comes to issues like house, land, and property, which are not solved from one day to the next. Achieving tenure security is often a medium to long-term process, and some things can be done within the medium term or short term, but then we need to have a longer perspective. And there is a gap currently, and that's also some of the discussions around the nexus, right? How to make sure that we can program and adapt the programming from the emergency response to the development phases to address HLP issues in a holistic manner, yes, resulting from conflict, but that are going to get more and more complicated as the climate change situation gets more and more serious. So how to do that? It's not that we have the key. We see interest in Somalia, for example, from development donors to also invest in responses, but I think that what we are lacking is that connection between that emergency phase and that development response. Not that I have the answer to that, but my advocacy point is for also the donor community to think into how can we do that. The World Bank Land Conference of the last, that is ongoing still today, has had several panels dedicated to climate change, but I do not think that a lot has been, there has been made a strong connection between that work with a development lens and the emergency response that happens before. Corporate social responsibility, where are the private actors? Some of them are expressing interest, but maybe they need to also step up in the support, since also we know that climate change is originated because of industry and other activities. So how those compensation mechanisms could be operationalized in a better way. And I think that for us, what we need to do is to also prepare and share more and more analysis of, the new trends that we are observing on the ground when conflict and climate change collide and affect communities in a different way that we have been observing previously. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think that we have a few extra minutes since we started a little bit post the scheduled time. So I wanted to open it up for any audience Q&A. If anyone has any questions, we'll be happy. Please.
They're able to continue, some of them online. This is why Dr. Libby is not here this morning. Where can one get assistance in the reacquisition of their property? He has all his papers in motion. And getting that university reestablished. Because while getting family settled in housing, those thousands who lives are hanging on the hook that they keep their education, raise to the level, set state, and the mental agony, thinking all the years they put in, it's gone. What do they do? Where does one go to get help like that? So far, it's been estimated that he's also working $1 million. This is one of the most modern universities in Haiti. I was there after the earthquake. I was amazed how quickly we got it back up. Modern campus. Thousands of students. And I know I serve in Haiti, a lot of them get scholarships, they can't handle this service no longer there. The profits got all over the place. Is there a place in USAID that would work with institutions that contribute to the pride of the country? That school is like 40 years old. It's an architectural school, but they cover everything. In fact, they were starting a medical program, but the woman who was working with that was kidnapped and killed. So that killed the health program. But others are going on. What do we want to do? We talked about property rights, your crisis. It's a crisis situation. It's about property rights.
Okay, so let me rephrase it because I think that maybe people that are watching it online might not have heard it. So the question is based on what to do in cases, or in this particular case, a university situation where the university might have been destroyed, services stopped. I don't know if we can provide any answers for that, but what kind of assistance and sort of like what would be the methodology for that?
Proving that they had a house and it was destroyed. There's an institution in which country. Where does one go in something like this? Because it does affect, you know, kind of the whole, a lot of lives and safety. I just need to know where. Is it a fee? Is there a special organization exists that can maybe help to improve this losses with financial aid from the U.S. government? Is he a U.S. citizen of the Haitian government? The money is coming in. Where do you go?
So maybe any other learnings from other contexts in which it's something similar as an educational.
Well, you know this as well, Miriam, because with shelter in NRC, part of what we do in Norwegian Refugee Council through the shelter assistance is reconstruction of educational facilities, right? Schools. I haven't heard that we are working with universities because the target of the programs in NRC is primary school, so not universities. And within that, what we are working with our colleagues is to get them trained in understanding issues around housing and property rights so that they can conduct due diligence activities when they are also building or rebuilding schools. Something that before wasn't all that common maybe, but that because HLP is gaining momentum, they understand that they need to make sure that they are having all the proper permits, licenses, and rights in place in order to do an intervention that is sustainable. But I do not know about universities in particular, and we do not work in Haiti, so I wouldn't be able to answer to that.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe I can just add a note on here, because this is one of the points that we're saying. Like now with climate change, it's more evident. They're like, it used to be, okay, if this is chronic poverty, is development, and if this is emergency after a disaster, is humanitarian. I think climate is kind of making that a little bit blurry. So this is just an important discussion to have. And the other point, as Fernando said, we're talking about community infrastructure. And there are some guidance to decide whether to intervene or not. Is it important to achieve programmatic outcomes? Is this a priority from the community? Is this essential to recover? If there's like a go, no go analysis with the community, there might be a possibility to engage, but it's really a little bit more complex to that, and we definitely can continue the conversation. And we have, of course, here some colleagues from USA you can ask directly as well.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Oh, yeah, okay. If anyone has any other questions, no? I have one, I'll take moderator privilege and I'll ask my question. One of the things that I was thinking about when we were hearing everyone's answers and talking about that engagement and tapping into local governments, local academia, business sector, one of the things that I was wondering is if any of you have seen any of the HLP issues be implemented or being thought about being included in national adaptation plans, so more at like the national level, now that countries are having to resubmit their national adaptation plans as part of the UNFCCC process, or it wouldn't necessarily fall into NDCs, but more in the national adaptation plans. I'm not seeing that integration of DRR, so I'm wondering from the HLP perspective if some of that is being thought about, if those conversations are happening at a national level.
We have not seen that in Jamaica. Most of what the government is putting together to meet their obligations to the Sendai framework are more related to early warning systems and community preparedness, at that level from their government platforms. But we have not really seen HLP as a component there. Yeah.
I think probably at the most is about like evacuation and kind of temporary kind of emergency response. but I would need to consult my colleagues in different to give you a specific about at the policy level. I think it can be there. And sometimes it's like working with our colleagues with the which are in turn talking to the local authorities. It is a matter of inserting a few questions that have a very direct HLP point. And we just did that exercise in Uganda, and I think that it is very organic to integrate. So I think we are gaining awareness now, and I think that's a natural next step to bring forward.
I would think that in some HNOs, humanitarian needs overviews and humanitarian response plans, this is appearing already. I can think of maybe Central America, where the hurricanes affect the region regularly. You also have earthquake vulnerable countries like El Salvador, so natural disasters feature there. And the connection with HLP issues appears a little bit succinctly in those documents. I don't know of any other countries actually, but that is a context where I looked at just last year and I saw it appearing there. But it's a good point and something that we need to also inquire further actually. So.
Just one more point is that we were talking yesterday, like people know the risk, they are aware, they are the ones that suffer. And if we were going to be very strict, as that's what I try to say, this kind of zoning and it's anonymous, and they say, okay, this location might flood, therefore don't build here. But people who live in fishery, they need that access to their livelihood. And even though there will be impact, they say, I can't be here, I have a livelihood, I can live. And I'm going to take that risk. They have, like even in the most precarious slum communities, they see value in those communities. If we say to not build zone at all in these areas because in the development plan we'll take a risk, but that's 50% of the population who live in those precarious zones, and they see value in it. So I think we need to be a little bit more curious, and that's where we need action plans, but HLP gets very personal, gets very specific, and that's where we need to be careful.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. All right, so I see that we have 1 minute left, so if I can quickly, you can definitely come and ask us questions afterwards. Some of us will stick around, and I think that we're all more than happy to answer questions, if that's okay. I just wanted to highlight a few points that I saw that that were mentioned by everyone, and one of that, the big one, is the importance of the relationships with local governments, academia, business sectors, and local networks in having a more managed response, and also the importance of amplifying local visions and promoting synergies that are already there. And also the importance of technical assessments and technical training and learning, providing the learning opportunities for HLP issues to be integrated in other sectors. I think those were some of the main points that came up. I wanted to thank all of our panelists today for this wonderful conversation. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. Oh, we have another panel coming up. Don't slip out. You can talk to them at lunch if you have further questions for them. I'm going to ask our next panel on HLP in practice and academia to come up.
I want to introduce the three panelists for this session. It should be an exciting session. We have Jennifer Pindick, who is an assistant professor in architecture and interior architecture at the department, in the architecture department at Auburn University, and is a registered architect. Her research interest focuses on the study of inequalities and systems that impact the built environment. We're happy to have her. And Dalia Ndum, I think many might know Professor Ndum. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Architecture, I'm proud to say, here at Howard University. As a licensed architect, her practice and teaching experience spans the United States, Ghana, and other parts of the world. And then lastly, we have Ana Cristina Gomez Perez, and she is a professor of property law, succession, and trusts at the University of Puerto Rico. Over the past 4 years, she has spearheaded a legal research initiative sponsored by Habitat for Humanity's Puerto Rico, aimed at finding tangible collective solutions to land tenure issues in Puerto Rico. With that, I would like to welcome our panelists.
Hi, architects like visuals, so, okay. Now this may look like a natural disaster, but it's not. It's springtime in Forkland, Alabama. This is representative of a slow motion, multi-generational public health disaster of our own making. We often think of rural areas as rich in land availability, but poor in housing opportunities. The reality is that the sites we work on are constrained, and a lot of that has to do with issues of land ownership. Because we work in the region known as the Black Belt in the US, I'm going to speak about this area directly, but we know that this impacts many areas beyond this region. The area we work in is considered to be persistently impoverished, which simply means that 20% or more of the residents of a given county have lived consistently and persistently in poverty for 30 years or more. And of these persistently impoverished counties in the US, over 85% of them are rural. And while these areas are distinct, they are all historic landscapes of extraction, where resources, and in our case cotton, have been taken out of the ground through uncompensated human labor and with no resources put back. This is, of course, a place of great financial wealth and cultural wealth, but it's also a place of absolute abject poverty. And this is an issue of heirs property. Over the last 100 years, there's been a consolidation of farmland. The average farm size has increased, the number of farms decreased, but the total amount of farmland has remained the same. In the Black Belt region, this has come at the expense of African American farmers. One of the many components to the consolidation of rural land is the exploitation of landowners without a clear deed of title, specifically those living on heirs property. Heirs property is an outcome of intentional systematic exclusion from financial and legal systems. For those living on heirs property, it can be challenging, if not impossible, to access critical financial resources and disaster aid services. So what is heirs property? Land has been acquired. Heirs property begins when a property owner dies without a clear will. This lack of will is most often a result of denied access to the legal system and distrust due to decades of systematic racial discrimination and predatory practices. The land is passed down to the next generation as tenants in common, meaning they own an undivided interest in the entire property rather than a physical piece of it. As the property continues to pass down from generation to generation, the number of tenants in common increases exponentially. Tenants in common do not have a clear or marketable title to the property. This is called clouded or tangled title, and it means that no one person or clearly defined group has legal decision-making authority over the property. Without clear title, the property typically would not be accepted as collateral, and it's incredibly difficult to receive financing for a home, obtain insurance, or use the property as equity because every one of the shareholders must legally sign off on any of these actions. Housing is an example of this. Left with no other alternative, families living as tenants in common on shared family land have traditionally turned to the aggregation of substandard second and third generation trailer homes, and now you see utility sheds to address their lack of adequate shelter. Each heir has equal rights to use and occupy the land. Because ownership is by share, regardless of the size of the share, any of the tenants in common can bring an action in court asking for petition of the property. So if an heir sells their share to an outside party of any percentage, this entity is also a tenant in common. And while there are many ways to partition a property, partition sale, the forced sale of the whole property, has created the greatest loss of land. Tax partition sales, tax liens, and other predatory practices against owners of heirs property have been used to push people off their land, leading to enormous land loss, difficulty in building generational wealth, and distrust in the legal system. The exploitation of heirs property is especially prominent where we live in the Black Belt and disproportionately affects Black Americans the most. Our research coalition, which includes Fannie Mae, the Housing Assistance Council, Florida Housing Coalition, Louisiana Appleseed, and the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, identified 3 basic strategies necessary to addressing and possibly eliminating the negative outcomes of living on heirs property. First, it's essential to mitigate heirs title issues from occurring in the first place through proper real estate planning, education, and community engagement for lower wealth property holders. Second, for properties that have already fallen into heirs titles, strategies should be designed to help remediate heir properties issues to remedy the lack of clear title. And third, for heirs property owners who simply can't prevent or remediate their title issues, we have to do something anyway. So products, policies, programs, and partnerships have to be crafted to help alleviate the negative consequences posed by heirs title. Reform in the government, legal systems, and financial institutions are beginning to protect and invest in these communities. Most specifically, the Uniform Partition of Heirs Act, which is enacted in 22 states to date. And another example of this is Howard University's Law School outreach is working with communities on estate planning and processes around probate. The third space is alleviation, and it's where Rural Studio can be the most actionable. Rural Studio is Auburn University's design-build architecture program in which students spend anywhere from 1 semester to as many as 2 years of their 5-year undergraduate education. It's located in New Bern, which is about 3 hours west of Auburn's main campus, and students live and work there. Here you see Shepard and Alberta Bryant's house, the first project designed and built by Rural Studio students almost 30 years ago. And this home was built in Masons Bend, Alabama, on heirs property. Rural Studio has been deeply invested in studying the challenges of equitable access to housing since we began. This is Detyric's house, and this is being built today on heirs property. All of our students' research and development work is client-driven, with the home recipient introduced to the team early in the process. Through this interaction, the students begin to learn from our clients what is truly most important in their homes. Our students work directly with real clients on real projects. In addition to clients, the students work with community stakeholders and professional consultants. Through this process, the students learn how to both design and build their proposed project. As part of our ongoing research to better understand the barriers to equitable housing access in our community, Rural Studio students have designed and built numerous affordable housing prototypes over the years. In the third space of alleviation and being a place-based program and working in the community helps us understand what some of the opportunities are. And a culturally based understanding of heirs property provides insight into why it persists amongst rural African American communities. These family properties have also resulted in settlements of intergenerational kinship networks. In these small family settlements, a social structure and a system of land management has risen that has protected and sustained impoverished and historically oppressed families in rural areas for decades. And these networks provide resilience to the whole family through sharing of resources such as housing, income, food, transportation, and elder care. And while property lines have not been legally recorded, these boundaries are no less real and something we at Rural Studio must often design within. So we ask this question: what can we do? And our response is, we can design well-designed rural housing typologies that fit on these sites that is simultaneously efficient, resilient, durable, healthful, mortgageable, and affordable. And we have students respond to the sites they encounter directly. Here are 3 specific responses to heir property situation. As mentioned, sites are constrained. This is Detyric's family land. Students had to consider all of the constraints of a buildable area, such as the property boundary, family boundaries, existing structures, septic systems, which take up a lot of space, power lines, trees, and the driveway. The green area shows the property remaining that is buildable. And the students developed a small footprint house, 18 by 18, that can be implemented in many of these tight lots.
It is a multi-story structure. The first and second floors can be flipped depending on the site, but it provides housing for a young person and can grow with the growth of their family. Another option, and this is that house being built right now, and another option is replacement housing. This is a house for Rose Lee, and the idea is to keep Rose Lee sheltered in the original home and build a new home adjacent, and then demolish the original house. We are leveraging existing land ownership and the sunk costs of existing infrastructure. Once the existing house was demolished, a second wing was added for living accommodations for her 2 adult sons who had been displaced and were going to come back to living together. The houses are small, but the students designed an outdoor room for gathering. And the last option, there are many actually, but is reinforcing the family settlement. And here Rural Studio is building multiple houses on family land and researching new septic options with partners around the country for liquid waste. As an academic institution, our method and mission involves the activities of teaching, research, and outreach. This provides us with the opportunity to engage with partners across the local, regional, and national scales. The relationship between the pieces of this work is one of reciprocal knowledge building and information sharing. The object of the house is a vessel not only to understand how the design of the home can affect its performance, but also to explore how the procurement of that home affects the larger systems of land use, zoning, lending, insurance, and more. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Delia Endum, an assistant professor here at Howard University, and I'm going to talk a little bit about HLP and pedagogy, just picking up on the work that Jen talked about. And so here at Howard, we have approached our work through a justice lens, and this has often probed the intersection of race, gender, economics, social inequities that have compounded to exacerbate vulnerabilities to climate change. And so this is something that Dr. Versi has talked about in her piece on intersectionality and compounded vulnerability, where she talks about the need to broaden the collective knowledge about place-based and racialized access to land and water, and how histories of race and contemporary racial inequities continue to shape environmental threats. And so this is something, she's talking about it specific to the US context, which is something we're interested in as practitioners and academics here at Howard University. And while she's talking about these issues through a psychology and public health perspective, we see that it's very necessary for us as architects to also understand these intersectional issues and how can we begin to shape architectural responses. And so this is our mission. We're trying to figure out how can we educate our students in this vein. And so we think it's essential to understand the lived experiences of affected communities and their relationships to the built environment. So for example, in our studios, we have studied how cultural connections to place, land, and livelihood affect risk perceptions and increase the difficulty of transitioning to alternative homes and communities. We have also studied collective land ownership, such as community land trusts in Puerto Rico and Anacostia here in DC, and communal hereditary ownership in Barbuda. Students have been tasked with understanding how do we design for affected communities with this knowledge of the sociological implications of culture, community, security of tenure, and connection to place. And so this is a framework that we've been exploring specific to our design studios, where the students are kind of branching out and exploring research and issues outside of the discipline of architecture. So it's a process of exploratory thinking. So they're looking at issues of culture, history, politics, legal issues, issues of access to secure tenure. And then there's this domain-to-domain transfer where students then begin to synthesize this information through various processes such as mapping, video, photography, writing, et cetera, before coming up with their architectural concepts. So a lot of the work has stressed the process, not necessarily the product of architecture, but really kind of digging deep into all of these kind of intersectional and interdisciplinary issues. And so for today, I'm just going to talk very quickly about a studio that was conducted this spring. The focus was Puerto Rico, which will then lead us into Ana Cristina's talk. So the studio approached this through this exploratory thinking, very intensive research. Before, the students were tasked with designing transitional housing and then eventually permanent, resilient, incremental housing specific to the community of San Isidro, Puerto Rico, which you could see a FEMA flood map here. So San Isidro is a community that is an informal community. It's a community that is still recovering from Hurricane Maria in 2017. And it's a community that, in addition to a lack of deeded title for land, there is also the fact that it is in a flood zone. So it's a kind of dual issue with getting FEMA funding, the flood zone issue, but also the land title issue. And so the students were kind of grappling with these multitude of issues as they began to approach their design. I'll flip through some of the process. We were talking about pedagogy and how we educate our students in this vein. There's lots of reading. The reading was quite varied, from reading on psychology and compound vulnerability, readings on trauma-resilient design and how we can do no harm through our architecture, readings on shelter and settlements, and the list goes on. And of course, understanding land tenure issues was also really important for the students. We had workshops with Joseph here, with students who were looking at shelter issues, but also understanding the kind of range of tenure issues that can drive decision-making throughout post-disaster. Students also had case studies. So this was a case study from Mr. Francisco Susmel from Techo, looking at transitional housing when it was built versus how it's been adapted to permanent housing, but then understanding the realities of the various solutions and some of the land and tenure issues that were wrapped up in these approaches. So this reality check was very important for the students. Looking at also, architects on the ground, Dr. Mayra Rivera Crespo, and some of the work she was doing to understand what does resilient housing mean in the Puerto Rican context. So ideas of self-building, incrementality, participatory community engagement being very important to the process. And then finally, looking at organizations such as the Centro de Integración Comunitaria San Isidro. This organization started after Maria as a psychology and legal clinic to provide legal aid to the community to address some of those land tenure issues. And one of the things that came out of the conversations with Dr. Ortega was that not having a space for their meetings became a really big impediment to the community being able to organize and come together to pursue alternative land title processes such as community land trusts. So that was something the students really took to heart as part of their design, to think about spaces for the community to organize. Finally, went to Puerto Rico as well, participated in the conference in Puerto Rico and engaged in community engagement activities with our partners in San Isidro. So finally, what does that all look like as a design product? So I'm just going to show one kind of brief overview of a project. This is by Sierra Espinoza, and I'm showing this one because this student really started with the idea of a community land trust as being the foundation of her design. As architects, we kind of start, let's think about the design first and what that could be, but it was really kind of looking at the land first and ways of structuring ownership before thinking about the design. So for her, it was this relationship between community land trusts and trauma-informed design, and the idea that the community land trust, being the steward of the land, could be a way to foster community, familiarity, resilience, sustainability, but also exploring ideas around comfort, connection, right? The community leaning on each other in times of crisis, and choice. So there's this idea of incrementality and growth that the student thought could be fostered by the land trust, kind of given a sense of stability. And so this was something that became about these sort of micro communities with courtyards, and that residents were encouraged to explore programmatic activities that were interspersed throughout these micro-communities. So all of these programs were programmatic elements that came out of conversations with the Psychology and Legal Clinic. So you could see the Community Center, Resilience Hub being very important as a space for organization, food sovereignty through community gardens, and then of course the housing interspersed throughout. This is just a closer look at the housing, which was designed to be incremental and grow over time, and that there will be these sort of community spaces in between that are part of the community land trusts that the land trust would kind of steward those spaces. Just a more zoomed in look at the housing, just kind of highlighting some of those opportunities for expansion and incrementality. And so I'll flip through just a couple of views where the student was trying to get a sense of what these homes could look like. I won't go into a lot of the other kind of issues. They relate to the trauma-informed design part of it, but I'm focusing on her ideas around the land and the land trust. But just some views around like what these kind of in-between community spaces could be. And once again, it was this idea that the land trust would allow for some of these spaces to occur, such as this community garden, which would be shared by the community, and then other spaces of gathering, potentially being able to sell goods, kind of home-based entrepreneurship type of opportunities that could happen within these in-between spaces. And so finally, I'll end with some of the themes that the students have explored. I focused today on issues of land and connections to place and rights and justice, but just highlighting that there was a range of interconnected issues, like access to secure tenure and land does relate to one's mental health, for example. And so it relates to one's autonomy. And so the students were really looking at a range of issues throughout the studio. And while this was a speculative project, it had a real world community engagement, but it was speculative, but how could it, we were thinking about how this work could inform ways that we think about land and HLP domestic policies and practice. And one of the takeaways was that ensuring that we're educating the next generation of architects to kind of think about these complex informations, making connections across these seemingly disparate issues, and recognizing the power of architecture to negatively and positively affect the built environment. Thank you.
Thank you. I am a law professor, as you know, and my perspective is pretty much different. I learn a lot, but we have the same issue with the earth property in Puerto Rico. I think even worse. That is one of the main problems. I think the academia had a special role in this issue, and we can work together in a different areas. First, research. I think in my area, at least, help to identify partners of displacement, land tenure, security, and the impact of the law of property on population, especially on vulnerable population. What happened in my case, I have this research for 4 years, founded by Habitat for Humanity Puerto Rico. The most vulnerable population didn't have access to recovery funds, FEMA funds, because they don't have ownership deed or documented tenure. That was one of my findings. And also, one other one is that when people live in community land trust, people with no tenure documentation did have access to funds because they find a different ways to prove ownership or relationship with the land. And I think this is really important, but because we didn't realize how important is the community property and how important is the active communities to resolve the problems, especially after a disaster. I think also we have the responsibility as a lawyer to work on police developments. We need to draft guidance, laws, and all other things that help communities to understand, to be educated, to be empowered of the solution, but also to work on drafting law for lawmakers to be sensitive, to be on the way that we need to. And from my perspective, we work on community land trust toolkits that I think after we can share the toolkit to empower community, to explain the community what is a community land trust. Because even when we know as a lawyer what is a very complex concept, we need to educate communities. Maybe it's not the solution for all the communities, but the community has to know that what is community land trust, and they can decide if they want to use it or not use it. But at least we need to empower them with the knowledge of this tool. Also, I work with the Department of Housing with a guideline for land tenure and how different ways to prove a relationship with the land for people who suffer the disaster and need access to recovery funds. Also, I drive the law. One law is special just for people, like I told you before, like we talked yesterday, about a special law just for people after Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Irma, and the earthquakes. And this law is only designed to help them to have access to federal funds. But on the process, we realized that we can have a special law every time we had a disaster. We need to think what we had to do to change the law, because now the law is not designed to help vulnerable people to access funds. One of the main problems, like I said yesterday, but I repeat today after your presentation, is the air property that we have. It's very expensive to clarify the title, to have access to title after a person die, their family problem, and also that is not a problem in the United States, but it's a very huge problem in Puerto Rico and all the civil countries. The forced air law that is very difficult, because even when you had a will, you can left some of your family out of the state, and they had the right to have part of the state, and you find a lot of problems related to that. Also, we work on the bill. It's still a bill. I hope someday it will become a law, and it's related to reduce the adverse possession term, because it's 20 years now, and I think still is a lot. We need to reduce it because now everything is changing, and we need to help people to have access to land, especially in Puerto Rico, that is a very small island. Then I think it's important to educate and training. We educate the new generation of lawyers in Puerto Rico. Of course, we have the responsibility to teach them about this subject, about the land tenure problem in Puerto Rico. Also, educate community, empower the community to find themselves the solution. We had a law clinic in Puerto Rico that students work with communities, especially on this field, and it's really important for the students and also for the communities, because everybody is learning from that process also. And also, we had to educate, the word is educate, judge, because even when you don't believe me, one of the most resilient, one of the people who doesn't want to change is the judicial system, because they're still thinking that everything is okay. They want all go through the judicial process, even when it's really expensive, it's really long. They are still thinking is the only way to ensure rights of people. And they think if we find an alternative way to resolve land tenure problem, is because we are against some rights of some people, and we had to protect everyone. But that's not true at all. And I think one of the main problems I have in Puerto Rico right now is not the law. We already had a law, but we don't have judges who are who embrace the law, who apply the law. They act like it's no law at all, even, believe me. And I have been working with the Judicial Academy also, teaching about what is the impact of this, explain that we need to move faster because we are going to lose federal funds if we don't spend the money before 2028. And we're still waiting. And then educate Department of Housing, of course, educating lawyers, educating different groups to not only in the legal technical aspect, but also to feel the problems, to know how this problem affects vulnerable population. I think it's one of the most important learning that I have after this conference is because I feel how this problem that maybe is an abstract for me, is a legal issue, impacts the life of a lot of people around the world, not only in Puerto Rico. Then advocacy and public engagement, of course, and we need to influence the public opinion and policy, collaborate with NGOs, governmental bodies, and international organizations to promote policy that protect the rights of those affected by crisis, of course. Public lecture, publication, and media appearance. I had one of these in Puerto Rico, and thank you. We had this wonderful conference last month in Puerto Rico, and it was really important, not only about the technical issue, not only about what happened after Maria. For us, it was therapeutic too, because we never talk about this in that context. And we have this opportunity from different group of people who have been working with this big problem that we had in Puerto Rico for years to express their feeling, to express what they are doing there, how they are working there, and what problem they find on the path. And then they realize that everybody is working in a different areas. Maybe they don't talk to each other. And if they start to work together, they can be stronger to resolve that problem. And I think that was the most important learning that I feel that we had after the conference in Puerto Rico. It's strange that someone has to come outside Puerto Rico to have this conversation between us. But that's the way that things happen sometimes. We never know how. But I think it was really important for us because we had this unique and wonderful experience after. And then one final part is the innovation solution. We need to rethink some things because the law is not working, at least in my field. We need to change it. We don't need to assume that because it's a law, that is a law that had been around for decades, thousands of years, some of them, is perfect. No. Everything is changed. We had climate change. We had migration. We had a lot of issues, and we need to rethink our relationship with the land. We need to rethink the ownership rights. We need to rethink the tenure rights in a more broad, more worldwide context, not just Puerto Rico. I think we need to rethink around the world. Then, finally, cross-disciplinary collaboration. I'm learning a lot now from architecture fields. I know I'm learning now for planning and from all NGO. I feel so happy to be here and to learn a lot because I feel that now I had more knowledge to give to my students to feel the importance of this issue. Thank you.
Go ahead. Okay, yeah. All right, I think we're going to open it up to any questions from the audience. If you do have a question, we'll have to ask you to come to the mic just to make sure it's captured on Zoom. Any questions? Yes, yes, please, yeah.
Thank you. I'm wondering, if there's a lot of consideration given to new technologies in building materials, such as the compressed agricultural fiber board, that serves more than one purpose, because if you adopt that process in a semi-rural area, then you're creating jobs for farmers who are suffering, because then they're encouraged to grow grains that give grass or trash that they can now sell to the company that's processing it to make the compressed agriculture fiberboard. For those who are not familiar with that, it's a process where trash is taken from agricultural sections. It's compressed by companies. There's equipment. We'll compress this material, and it will coat it with a heavy-duty craft paper. The glue or adhesive that they use is pest-resistant. The product is then formed into wall boards that can be put on tracks. A house can go up in 2 days. I have some of the material that I keep, but it's things like it's hurricane resistant, earthquake resistant. There's nothing, but resistant. And you can hold an acetylene torch to it for 45 minutes without the product burning. So because there are panels, and thank you, I enjoy looking at the studio material. There are panels that can be arranged in such a way, you can do 2 stories as well, but the panels can be used to form really creative spaces for families. And there are banks and there are restaurants that are using it now in this country, and there are houses in Europe that have been using it for 40-some years and they're still standing. So I was just wondering, is that taken into consideration for settlements so that it could be progressive? It's not something that's temporary, but something lasting for the community. Thank you.
I think, Jen, do you want to take this? Just because, or maybe even speaking to what, if you aren't using these type of materials, what are you using for the projects that have been done?
Sure.
Yeah.
When the program started, a lot of the materials were donated. So there were, we were using windshields and carpet tiles, and there was sort of a lot of experimentation. Now there's a sort of movement towards building resilient houses and understanding the sort of long-term maintenance of a structure. And so we are experimenting with a lot of CLT now. A lot of the construction is wood frame, but now we're sort of getting into structures that are fortified, also shelter in place, and a lot of that, because Alabama has a large timber industry, we're using a lot of the products made in Alabama. So there is conversation happening. We have not started using the panels you're referring to, though, but we're definitely doing material research. Thank you for that question.
Hi, yeah, I wish I'd been on any of your courses. I think you're all like super inspiring people to be taught to. I just wonder what you think, kind of what you see as kind of career paths, kind of ways forward for the students going forward, like what opportunities there are to remain in kind of these related fields that we're talking about.
So I think that's the big question, right? And I've had these conversations in Puerto Rico and this conference. I think a lot of what we've been doing is exposure. I think the cross-disciplinary piece becomes really important, because then you're tapping into kind of other paths that, for example, an architect may not have been aware of, just due to some of those conversations and classes across and outside of the discipline. But I think there is a conversation to be had, and maybe that's something to talk about for the next conference, like what are some of the paths in this HLP space for students, especially US students, to get into this space without traveling to Europe, for example, to attend a course to do that. So I would say the cross-disciplinary has potential, but how do we kind of make that path a bit clearer in the future? If you have anything to add, yeah.
I completely agree, and I have been thinking a lot during this conference that I'm going back home and thinking on new courses, maybe a new perspective to my courses related to this. And I want to talk with my colleagues because I think we need to introduce, maybe we are not ready yet for all program, but maybe we need to introduce some elements of this, talking more about this, especially because Puerto Rico is on the path of hurricanes, and we know that a disaster maybe is coming in the near future. That's the way I think now.
And if I may add, the speaker this morning spoke about it as well as sort of this interdisciplinary work where architects and engineers are working together, but we should all be working as a larger sort of system. And I think that's, I mean, it shows in the course Dalia is teaching as well, is like we're thinking about systems thinking. And so we're encouraging our students to think outside of traditional architectural careers and please like go into other spheres. And I think we're all focused on sort of notions of critical thinking and then how do you think about the larger system? So that the sort of house is just one component of a much larger system, so.
And just to piggyback on that, I think it's, it is that kind of interdisciplinarity, but I'm breaking down the silos, which is what a lot of this conversation has been. But I think one of the things for us and everyone to discuss is how do we do that? How do we break down those silos, especially in institutions that may not be as flexible to break down those silos? And so I think that's a bigger discussion to have. How do we maneuver within those bureaucracies potentially? Eva? Oh, sorry.
Oops. Thanks for the presentation. I think kind of connecting to the question that Joseph was asking and connecting to your presentation, something that is striking and looking at what humanitarian actors and organizations are looking to is the need for diversity and inclusion. And a question that I had, and not to highlight it, but seeing all of the students at Arbonne, all of them seem to be white, and all of the clients seem to be Black. And then students at Howard trying to work in these areas. How do we try to get more diverse students to be able to get in these paths, not only in different universities, which I understand that in some cases are segregated, but also in our agencies, and making sure that there is a path that includes the ability to pay students so they can actually pay back their student loans. I think it's a much more complicated piece than just having the course, but how can those tracks be identified, not for the privileged students that might be able to do it, but for those who actually will need the push and the support to do it in a way that they can actually be part of the system without all of the lagging that they have behind.
I think that was a statement because I have nothing to add. I agree. Yeah. I think we have one more minute, so maybe one final question.
Hi, everyone. Leslie Wilson from Refugee Housing Solutions. So a slightly different angle, a different group of people who are affected by disaster. Well, the disaster of having, for example, to emigrate from wherever they were to Europe or here or wherever. And I come from a family of architects and engineers, which I'm not one of, but thank you so much. I'm just thrilled that at the intersection is coming. And the person was asking about, the gentleman was asking about careers. So architects just need to become humanitarian and development workers, right? So that connection can be made. But I have two, actually, I guess they're questions. So I was in Indonesia when there was an earthquake, tsunami, land liquefaction, and just this whole area of the country just disappeared. The houses went rolling down the hill, and those families were homeless. And one of the responses, of course, was the traditional response to build emergency shelter. But fortunately, we had Japanese government funding, so it was extremely well-built emergency shelter. And you knew that these families, they were going to live here for 10 or 20 years, the rest of their lives. So just that nexus of, especially as technology and design allow, to think more and more about not building temporary shelter, but going to the next level. So as you work with your students, that might be something to think about. And then a real question for all of us. My focus is refugees coming to the United States. I'm here with a number of my colleagues. So we're looking at refugees coming here, but they will not be landowners ever. Now, so there's the justice issue of reclaiming and respecting land tenure from generational dispossession, if you will. But then with refugees and people who are new to the United States, when a disaster strikes, how do you reach out with government? It has to be FEMA, whomever, to make sure that they are dignified and respected in the rebuilding process. So I guess just as you work with your students, and maybe there's stuff going on already, but I wanted to mention it. Thank you.
Any response to that? Because I think that was a statement too. Yeah. And I think we're at time as well. But thank you. I think these were really great insights for us to think about as we continue this work. And since we're at time, I'd like to thank panelists for joining and potentially future collaborations here as well. So thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you. And I think we have a new agenda item for next year's conference, a career panel. I am going to ask the next panel, Recording Land Rights in Crisis Contexts, to come on up.
So this session here is on recording land rights. As you are aware, land rights are complicated to record. In Western societies, we see land rights as something very rigid and very well-defined. So we have a well-defined plot of land, a well-defined home. The subject of the right is a well-defined person with an ID. And the right is also very well-defined legally. The legislation defines what the types of rights and the obligations that are attached to that right. But in most parts of the world, this is not the case. So in most parts of the world, the property itself might not be well defined, it might be fluid, right? So plots of land might not have hard boundaries, right? People will say, well, our land, our community land here goes, over there, but we don't know exactly what it is. So it's undefined, it's fluid. Also, the rights are often very undefined and very fluid. People say, yeah, we live here, but in some parts of the year, there's some other group that comes through and graze in this area and leave. So this is the right to the property is also not defined. And sometimes the subject of the right is also not defined, because yes, it can be a person, but it can be a group, and defining groups is notoriously difficult. And the subject of the right might be also intergenerational, which is also difficult to define because you don't know who's going to be born next. So just saying this to highlight the fact that recording rights, yes, it's very important because you can take immovable property with you, and so you need a system to record it, to connect you to the property. But at the same time, in most parts of the world, it's very difficult to do this type of recordation. And so we thought it was valuable to have a session specifically on how to record land rights and methodologies to doing so. And Cadastre Foundation is one of the the main organizations that think about these problems and work on these issues. And so JP is here today to talk to us a little bit about their approach to doing so. Thanks, JP. You want to introduce yourself better than I did?
Buenos días. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Well, my name is Juan Pablo Solis, JP. I work in Cadastre. And let me take a couple of minutes to explain what we do. And then I want to show an example that we have done in this particular scenario, I mean, on this type of disaster recovery. So Cadastre was founded in 2015, and the mission that we have is to be the leading provider on technical tools and services to support documentation on land. Basically, what we provide is technology to indigenous communities, small groups, organizations to map their land. In some cases, customary land, like in Africa, community mapping, Indonesia, for example. So we give to them training. We try to build internal capacity so they can take their own decisions about measuring the parcels that they have. And in many cases, the legal status of land needs to be done by the government, right? So we provide all the inputs, we provide all the information that they will need to have a proper titling. Now, how we work. We provide technology, meaning that we have scalable and flexible, high-quality tools. We do also a lot of training. We love to do train-the-trainer approach because, it's important for us not to be the one that will do all the training all the time. So we build internal capacity. Currently, we are working in Indonesia, in which we are working with JKPP, an organization that they are doing mapping for about 30 years. And they do like physical mapping, meaning like they use paper, still use paper. So we are providing with tools to systematize that process, but also using the technology, using maps that are available these days. This is the platform that we have. We are based on the Esri platform. We provide mobile data collection tools. We have secure storage because most of our data are stored in the cloud. There are some cases in which you want to have your own servers or on-premise services. That's also what we provide. The important piece about this technology is that you have two pieces. One is the mobile side, in which you go into the field and capture the data. And the other one is you can see the data on your desktop using dashboards. Okay? So I will show in a couple of minutes what we have done. But for me, it's important to see both sides. When you go into the field, you talk with the people. You capture data, you take photos, you make videos, you get signatures as well. But if we go to the office, you need to see what you are doing. You need to see how the flow of the data is going. And most important, you will see the data in real time. Okay? So that's a different type of mentality because in many cases and in many projects that we have work, there's two different times. You go into the field, capture data, you have a processing time, could be about months, probably, or weeks, and then you can see the data, and sometimes you need to review the data and go back to the field again. So what we're trying to avoid is giving to them the most up-to-date maps, I will say, using drones or using satellite imagery, so they can go into the field, capture the data, and do the corrections on the field with the partners or with the neighbors, okay? So that's one advantage that we do in using this platform. Now, for these partner stories, I will jump directly into one of examples that we have. This one. Back in 2022, we worked with Habitat for Humanity, the Caribbean Task Force, to do this disaster response and recovery forms, okay? At this point, personally, I have no idea what it means, meaning that what information they need to capture to help to these people. So the goal is to work together to set up an infrastructure to manage all the information related to let's say, to a disaster. The goal was to facilitate rapid assessment on the field, provide some mechanisms to implement monitoring about what's happening during that process, and also to consolidate a data model that works across different countries, I would say. A disaster could be different from country to country, but the information that you need to gather is almost similar or almost the same. So also, it's important for us to provide information about how you will measure the impact about collecting the data and how that information is managed through time. To do that, we create like 4 different types of surveys with different information. And we have some dashboards in which you can see how the data flows, okay? I will show you a couple of videos which will be more simple to see. So, as I mentioned here, we create 4 surveys. The first one is rapid assessment. It's a survey to be completed, the first assessment of a victim impact. We collect information required as a first rapid response. The second one is the same, but it contains more data. You can do both at the same time based on the type of disaster that happens. In some cases, you just need to collect the data of the people. In some other cases, based on the examples that they provide to us, you have more time to go into the field, get the point, get pictures about the plot, get pictures about the house, everything. So these are mostly the same, but different information. And this one is really important because then we have a way that you can monitoring what's happening during the week. Meaning that once you start the recovery process, you need to capture which are the contractors that are working in some specific areas, which are the materials that they're using, which are the activities that they have. So we also built like a database in which they have information about which are the entities, organizations, private sector, or people that can be used in some specific regions or areas. So you track almost all the process about this particular scenario. Then also you can document, as I mentioned, some information about the point of contact, the people that you need to tell or you need to talk with when something is happening in the middle of a situation, right? So let me jump into the example so you will see what information we capture. There you go. So this survey can work online and offline, okay? One important thing here is that this is based on maps, meaning that prior to a situation, you need to prepare your maps, and you can put imagery, you can have like data that you already have in some agency, you upload that information to the platform, so you add all the information that is needed to solve some specific situation. Here, it's entering all the information about how the data is captured, and for example, in this map, you could add as much as information as you need. So that's the bit about this. You can use this offline, so you have all the information in a tablet or a mobile device, go into the field and start capturing the points if it's needed, or any additional information that you will need. For example, the type of event, flooding, vector, whatever you need to have here. Let me go a little bit further. So here, for example, you enter about information about the person, the victim. Date of birth, gender, if you have some information about the address or the buildings. So based on the needs, this survey can be configured. What was interesting about this project, as I mentioned, personally, I don't have a lot of information in this type of scenarios, but we learn a lot. We work with this Caribbean task force in which they provide to us some forms about what information they capture in different times of the process. At the beginning, we do some test runs about, okay, yes, this is the information that is needed. Then we refine that form and then change it again. So it's like a learning process as everything, right? So here, for example, on the next phases, you could have information also about the households. But I want to show you some here. So there's many ways in which you can collect data. And that's the beauty about the forms, these smart forms. You need to select the information because if you enter tabular data or text, it's difficult to track. And it's difficult to classify too. Do a classification on the data. So we enforce or we explain to them that we need to categorize all the items that they want to capture. Here, you could add also some pictures. Let me see if that's, there you go. Okay. There you go. You could add a sketch. You could add different type of images based on the stage that you are. Okay. This is one technology. There's many technologies available in the market. It's basically what you need. It's based, based on your needs, you need to define what technology or what type of technology you could use. Cadastra, we're using every platform because it's simple for us, and we have like a partnership with them, so they allow us to use as much as possible. I mean, in the base maps, imagery, and everything. But also, there's many technologies available in the market if you want to use a different one. Let me go through this. So you capture all the data. As you can see here, it's about 20 pages of the form. And that's other thing. You know, when we start to gather or we start to review the requirements, there was a ton of paper that we want to capture. So we, first of all, organize the types of data that need to be present on each stage and help them to understand a proper way to have the data flow on the form. Because if you just add the data on the form, it's confusing. And if you are in an emergency, you need to capture as fast as possible and very accurate data. So that's one of the things that we also learned, that you know, we have done a user requirement first, do a test run about that, refine that process, and they move to the next stage. Otherwise, you know, it's like you want to add everything in one single form or one single page. And if you go to the field, that's impossible to capture, and you have a lot of mistakes. So that's also a lesson learned that we have. Then, let me finish this one. Then, once the data is captured, we create like 4 different dashboards. The dashboard now will show the information that was being captured in the field. And you can, again, you can do analysis here based on the map. You point on the map, and then you have the data related to that specific point. Or you can mix this data with other ones that you could have in, let's say, in Power BI or in an Excel file. You could have some analysis on this data as well. So this is the powerful about analysis, or this is powerful about having the data on these type of platforms. You could have the chance to spend time doing some analysis or some projections about what will happen here, okay? Let me show you another dashboard. There you go. Okay, so you can see here at the right side, every time you move into the map, the data changes. So that will give you also the chance to see what's happening in some specific regions. This tool was created for the Caribbean. At some point, they want to, to expand this to South America as well. Okay, and the last, this is our global impact dashboard, which is public on our site. And since 2015, we work on over like 49 countries, mostly on land, meaning helping communities to map their land or do some paralegal titling in Africa, for example. But these days, we learned that, if you capture a point on a piece of land, you could have a different type of attributes, like forests, like gender, like climate change. Like, for example, we have a project in Peru about fire alerts. So you give the chance to communities or a small group of people to manage the information that they need and to see that in real time. And for us, that's key because you are opening the technology to everybody, okay? Well, thank you.
Do you have any questions for Alex first?
Hey, all right.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. I think that the potential for this type of technology can be really, really transformative for the humanitarian sector, who I don't think has fully embraced it. In the work that the example that you gave seems to require very much sort of presence on the ground, communities still having access to their territories. But in so many humanitarian contexts, people are displaced and do not have the ability to return and to monitor their properties. And so I was wondering if there's any applications where Cadastre has worked with communities who aren't able to return to their areas, but to sort of keep sort of the ability to monitor their territories remotely, so that they can sort of record and identify potential HLP violations and track those things, or even secure or start sort of documenting and mapping their rights remotely. And so I'm thinking of some examples like in Myanmar, there are so many communities who have fled over the border to Thailand or to Bangladesh who aren't able to access their lands. Are there ways that these types of instruments can be used to help those communities at least sort of monitor HLP violations? Another example that comes to mind is in Cameroon. During sort of the peak of the Boko Haram crisis, the Cameroonian government had essentially dug a trench, like a physical trench, across a substantial segment of the country, and said, anybody on that side, on this side of the trench, has to move. It has to be relocated because this is sort of our security buffer zone. But what we had started learning is that while people had sort of emptied their lands, the government officials would start sometimes using, and military officials would sometimes start building and starting to sort of like encroach and grab those lands. And those communities had no ability to cross that buffer zone, because then they would be called Boko Haram and be considered terrorists. And so would there be ways to apply the methodologies so that communities could remotely monitor their territories and at least find ways to start protecting their rights? Over.
Thank you, Alex. That's a great question. And you know, you're talking about everything, right? Rights, communities. So you're talking about Myanmar, and we have a project there. And the interesting thing about this project is that that data is private. They don't want to expose, because that could be some problems with the people or with some other communities around. So in many cases, what we do as an NGO organization, we give them the tools to track or to measure the territory that they have. But there's the legal stage in which, you know, we can provide or export that data, let's say to a land information solution or a cadastral solution, so they can manage that data from that point to the future, right? So it depends on the project, I will say. And as I mentioned, some of them, they want to keep the data private, which for us, it's okay. We just not share nothing with nobody because they want to keep that information. Or in some cases, for example, in India, they want to keep the data within the India borders, meaning that we have some AWS server located in India. It's not possible to use like in Germany or in the US. So based on the needs, we try to give to them some strategies or alternatives.
Sandra.
This is a kind of a technical question. Just before the pandemic, I was doing a project in Kenya, and we were using ArcMap, Esri products, to try and digitize settlement schemes in the country, and worked great in Nairobi. But when we went out to Bomet and some of the rural areas, the bandwidth and the technical, you know, behind the scenes backstop that you need to run this stuff, it just all collapsed. And that was a problem in two ways. You know, it was a problem because, you know, ideally we wanted our work to be used by the county land commissions, and they couldn't afford the Esri products, and then they didn't have essentially the internet access that would allow them to run them. So I'm just wondering about if you could comment on that and discuss the fit for purpose, since we're all coming out of the land conference at the bank, you know, to discuss the fit for purpose nature of this product, because I see it and I see what it's trying to do, and I think it's highly desirable, right? I think, but I'm also wondering if there's a lighter way to run it.
I agree with you, and thanks for the question. Anyways, so cost will be always an issue, right? But even like an open source tool have a cost associated. So everything you need to pay for that. What we do is try to find the most cost-effective tools, okay? In our case, as NGO, we use the S3 NGO licenses, which the cost is lower than a commercial one. Now, talking about the accuracy or talking about the availability of internet, for example, that happens worldwide. Even in the US, there are some places in which you don't have a good connectivity, right? So for most of the cases in those specific regions, what we do is try to do the pre-data loading. Meaning, for example, at the office, at the land office, you have connectivity, so you download all the maps and you have everything here. If you need to use more accuracy, for example, we use like I will mention a couple of brands, Trimble and Bad Elf. Those are antennas that you can use on the field. The cost is not so high, and you can have more precision. Because at some point, we are talking about precision, right? So our approach is to have as much as data as possible, because that will give you more information to collect the points. And if you need more precision, add those tools into this ecosystem. These days, those are more available. 10 years ago, that was very expensive. But again, based on the case, we try to find the best approach for those specific problems. All of the countries are similar, but are different at the same time. So we work a lot in Uganda, in Nigeria, so we have the same problems. Even in South America, there are some places in which, based on the forestry and everything, it's impossible to do some work. So we have different type of scenarios, and we also work with partners. There's other NGOs that collect data using drones. There are other ones that collect using 360 cameras to the field. So it helps a lot to do a proper review on the field.
Any other questions to JP or comments? Yeah.
Thanks so much for the excellent presentation. I come from a humanitarian technology disaster relief background, and obviously we're all trying to shift more towards a preparedness rather than a response mechanism for long-term resilience. And nature-based solutions are obviously becoming a much bigger thing. And this seems exceptionally applicable for that. Have you, I guess on one side, have you done any nature-based solution applications with this? And then also another issue that I come into contact a lot is the lack of communication between communities that have similar issues that they're facing. So obviously you're working in, I think you said 40-something countries. Has there been any collaboration amongst those communities through Cadasta with the different applications that you find?
That's an excellent question. And the answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no. Because, for example, in Africa, there are communities that are together, neighborhoods, but they don't want to talk to each other. So the only thing that we can do is have the map that, set the boundaries, an agreement between all of them. There are some cases in which they have some old fights or problems. So for us, it's just we go them, help them, but it's very, I would say, a tricky issue to deal with some local problems, right? What we try to do many times, following the fit for purpose concept, is to try to go into the field and show them the maps. Because some people react, okay, yes, this is my boundary, I'm okay with you because I know that you are not trespassing my territory. So that helps a lot to solve some problems. But again, it's depends on what region you are, what type of community you are talking about, and also what's the goal of your project. If your goal is to try to measure land, that's risky because you are talking about rights. If you are trying to do, let's say, forestry or crops, whatever, it's more simple because everybody wants to have that. So it depends on the type of project that you're working on. But for Cadasta, it's interesting because, as I mentioned before, we started with land, with property rights. But if you have a point on the map, you can attribute as you want. So it depends on what you want to capture, You can explore different type of scenarios, forestry, climate change, everything. So that's an advantage because in some communities we show to them, look, you have this on your land. This is really good information for you to go further or to do some different type of economic development, whatever. So they realize that we are not just mapping the land, because we are mapping the whole territory as a whole, not just as a point in the map.
Thank you.
I have a question, not a question, but I have a point for discussion, which is this. So we've been, I mean, GIS technology has been around for decades. And when, I mean, doing traditional surveying is very resource intensive, you know, it takes people to go on the ground and total stations and da-da-da. And so when GIS technology started evolving, there was a big promise, right? And people said, okay, so now we can do that very cheaply and very quickly. And we're going to be able to, you know, cover all these grounds, and developing countries are going to benefit from this immensely. But it's been many decades now, and I don't think GIS technology has delivered on that promise. And I see that we keep insisting on trying to square that hole and trying to sort of force, you know, GIS onto this context where it's still very difficult to do. It's still, you know, the internet fails us, the electricity fails us, the literacy fails us, the digital literacy fails us. And so do you think is a moment where we should start considering exploring other technologies or other approaches to complement and try to deliver on the GIS technological revolution promises?
Yeah, have a good point. Well, my main answer is the main problem for me is that everybody wants to manage their own data, meaning that electrical companies, land registries, casual offices, they want to own their data. They don't want to share that data. That's one piece. Second one is there's no, at least not in the US, in other countries, they don't interconnect to each other. So even if I can manage my data, it's not possible for me to give you a service so you can access my data. So you have silos already. So if you have silos, it's different that this tool will help you a lot. Now, these days, we have a lot of data that is available for free. Or there's some other organizations that are producing that data. The problem is that we don't see that, and we are not putting everything together. Because if you have a problem, first of all, I want to collect, okay, what information that I have available in the market, or it's free. I see how much of this makes value to me. I create my own data, and I use that data for my purpose. So everybody who starts a project, this based on my experience, try to build their own data. So why you are not using data that's already available? We have a lot of data that's available for free these days with good accuracy. There's a lot of NGOs that are doing their own data as well, capturing, giving to you the access, but nobody's taking advantage of that. So my quick answer is GIS is good, but we are not using properly. That's my point.
Good. Any other questions? Yes, Miriam.
Well, you still see a kind of tension between your main message that we have a very rigid understanding of land tenure, ownership, and boundaries versus like the reality on the ground. And my concern is that these processes, unless really, truly consultative beyond the technology, can actually formalize inequality. So those who have access to technology, those who have voice in the community, are going to get formal rights that might compromise the rights of those who are not consulted or included. So we can, instead of having informal tenure and informal inequality, we're just formalizing and making something legitimate that might not be true or the right claims. So I just think that we need to emphasize that process to triangulate information. And yeah, community engagement not necessarily is representative of the most vulnerable. So those are my concerns too.
It's an interesting that happened this week in the bank as well. Every time we talk about formal rights, right? But we need to understand that the formal rights is given by the official institution on each country and based on the regulation. Is it possible for us, let's say NGO, to try to formalize the right because they will say, good, but I don't care. That's the reality, right? So that's the tricky piece because regulations in countries are totally different. And, you know, at the end, for them, I mean, for the agencies, the land, it's somehow taxation and money. Okay, that's the reality. That happens all the time. Even if we want to, you know, solve the problem of land, that will happen all the time. What we can do as organizations or a group of people that want to help is to try to map as much as possible and try to influence these agencies to use that data. Because otherwise they will do the same process again. And that's a waste of energy, time, everything. And also what is really important, when you start a systematized process, to, let's say, to do some mapping, you need to think about that you need to maintain that data since day one. Otherwise, you finish this process, you think about maintaining the data, but this is outdated already, right? Because as you're talking about inheritance and everything, that happens all the time. So there's no silver bullet, I will say, and you know, I'm in land for about 25 years, and it's the same problem since day one. Okay, formal rights, informal rights, you are trying to help, yes, but still now, we have the same problem. 25 years, and you know, I'm young on this topic, right? So even the old consultants, we're talking about same regularization process or projects in the bank, same problems in the community, so still the same. So we need to, I think, we need to understand that we need to collaborate with these agencies to give to them some information, and they need to use that information. That will help the process, you know. At least more people will have title, if that's the case.
Thank you. And maybe just a point regarding the urban-rural, maybe in rural areas we face still some issues in linking with the technology because of the literacy or because of the connectivity, yet in rural communities, there might be more room to move, there's more balance, and there is not so much pressure, versus in urban areas, we might have more access to connectivity. However, there are more overlapping lands and more tenure systems that overlap in terms of tenants and different land rights. Correct. So I think these are like just asking us to embrace this complexity, I guess.
Yeah, but you know, you need to understand also that at some point rural will become urban, right? At some point, because you know our rural areas every time is smaller all the time. So there's some places in which you have all the maps. The problem is the regulation that are managing those lands. So technology is there. I think that we are not still using it the proper way. That's my review after all these years working in land projects and NGOs as well.
Thank you.
All right, I think we are at the end of our session today. Thank you very much, JP.
Thanks to you.
We're gonna break for lunch. No? Oh, sorry. Wait, we have a word. Sit down, Fernando. We have lunch soon.
Sorry to stand between you and lunch. So I think one of the key themes this morning was breaking silos between different communities of practice, whether it is humanitarians, development actors, and academia, or between sort of US focused and internationally focused. And these conferences have been amazing. The one last year, the one in Puerto Rico, and of course this one now. And the conversations that we've been having are extraordinarily rich. And we want to find ways to sustain that momentum and those connections across those silos of practice. And so one of the things that we are trying to figure out is what are the best ways to help facilitate those conversations to continue. Obviously continue them sort of informally and organically, but also in ways that sort of can bring even more people in who haven't been able to attend these conversations. And so what we would like to ask you is while you're picking up your lunch, have a look around the coffee and on the 2 pillars, there's QR codes. It is a very, very, very short survey, like maybe like 1-2 minute max, and just fill it out and just let us know if there are ways that you would like to engage and continue to engage and try to find what sort of is the most appropriate platforms and modes of sustaining those connections. So yeah, just, and then also post-lunch sessions, they start at 1:30. Thank you. Actually, can I ran up. And so after lunch, we're going to have 3 exciting sessions. One is lessons for intelligent crowdsourcing on HLP. And those are findings from the American University's research practicum that they did in collaboration with IOM. And that will be at the back of the innovation space. So that is that room back there that I don't think we've used thus far. And then there's going to be the same 2 rooms as yesterday upstairs. What they call the gallery is sort of that place that has sort of the open windows. There's going to be a conversation about HLP practice beyond silos. So taking the conversations that we had sort of in panels this morning, but moving it into more of a workshop and sort of trying to figure out the specific ways that we actually break down those silos rather than sort of, and sort of bringing your knowledge and your thoughts into that. And then the last one is in sort of the more classroom format upstairs is recording tenure and comparing different types of methodologies. And so again, sort of taking some of the conversations that we've been having today and sort of going more into the weeds on that and bringing sort of people's different experiences on that. And so that will start at 1:30. In the meantime, enjoy your lunches.
Thanks, Alex.
I just want to do another round of thank yous. First to Howard for hosting us. We really appreciate the space and the partnership here. Also to USAID VHA for the support for this conference and these conversations and this work. To the organizing committee, IOM, Habitat for Humanity, NRC, the HLP AOR, University of Puerto Rico, and Variant Solutions. You guys are great. That's why the content here these last 2 days has been so great. Really big shout out to Victoria Powell from IOM. Victoria handled all of the logistics and stuff for this conference, which is a job that often gets overlooked. So please thank her before you leave. It's a lot of work. Just a few things that we heard today, obviously, the importance of HLP across crisis response and the need to ensure that HLP is prioritized in funding, in programming, and in coordination. The need to really engage with multiple stakeholders in this work. So many of us here are humanitarians, but we also have development actors, peace building, government donors, academics, private sector, and most importantly, local actors and communities. As we've talked a lot about today, HLP rights are not just the remit of technical experts, but everyone working in crisis prevention and response really needs to understand how to address them. We talked a lot about how to encourage students to join this sector. So that would be a great way to collaborate in the future with the University of Puerto Rico, Howard, and other universities in the places where you all live and work. And then, as Alex mentioned, we have also been talking a lot about how to continue this conversation in many different ways. As a reminder, these QR codes are for a survey on further engagement and a way to kind of keep these conversations between conferences going. There'll also be some work done on advocacy on HLP and hopefully future iterations of this conference. So thank you all for coming and participating and making these discussions really great. So thanks, everyone. Quick logistics, somebody left a water bottle at last night's happy hour. If this belongs to you, please come and get it. Secondly, if you signed up for the training, we're actually gonna have to cancel that. Super sorry. It would have been really great and interesting, but we are gonna cancel that. So coffee, networking, or you can go home for the evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Judy.